Welcome, everybody, to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Mardiege, coming to you guys today on April the 9th with another round of topics and stories to talk about on today's episode. I'm going to start off with the Pittsburgh Steelers, why they sit in a very favorable spot to potentially trade back, and why a lot of teams are going to be after their number 20th overall pick in this year's draft. Then I'm going to be going more into my top 5 players, coaches, or teams under the most pressure to perform this coming season or else. Later on in the show, I'm going to be talking about the Rams and them having a first-round pick for the first time since 2016. What the outlook for them looks like around the 19th overall pick, whether they should trade it, keep it, draft somebody. It's all going to be talked about later on. Then at the end of the show, I'm going to talk about CeeDee Lamb and his contract situation right now with the Dallas Cowboys, entering in that final year, how that all plays out into their plans long term and in 2024. All of that will be discussed on today's episode. Make sure to drop a follow, a like, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. And before I start with the first segment, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions, comments that you want to make during the live show, use the tip and donations link you see on your screen right now, gsmcpodcast.net, with any of your questions or comments. Using that link makes it easier for me. I can see your question pop up in my chat box. I can read your question on air, then have more of a conversation, make it more engaging. It's a lot better in my opinion, and it's a big help for this show if you guys are able to use that link. Once again, the link to the tip and donations is gsmcpodcast.net. Big thank you to you guys if you guys are able to use that during today's live episode. But like I mentioned before, going and starting in the city of Pittsburgh, they have the 20th overall selection in this year's draft. Their biggest needs, even though they've addressed a good amount of them in free agency, there's still some glaring needs at offensive tackle, at center, wide receiver, and defensive back. Just to recap some of the moves that the Steelers have made, they've brought in Patrick Queen. They traded away Deontay Johnson, but have tried to replace a little bit of that loss with Van Jefferson. They brought in Quez Watkins. That was on the offensive side. On the defensive side, like I mentioned, Patrick Queen and Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, taking all the headlines really for the Steelers all season. But like I mentioned before, offensive line still remains one of the biggest things for them, and that's where I wanted to start this conversation. Yesterday, I mentioned the Packers, the Commanders, the Eagles, as some of the teams looking to trade up with the Seahawks specifically to try and acquire some of these offensive linemen, defensive backs that are all starting to go around the mid-teens, the 10s to 20s, in that range right there between those picks, starting from the Jets and ending with the Steelers. The Steelers find themselves in an interesting spot, I think, because they already have a good amount of picks, and I mentioned those 4 positions as their biggest needs. Looking at the teams that I talked about yesterday with the Packers, Commanders, and Eagles, trading up to 16 would obviously cost a little bit more because you're moving up a bit further up, and to be honest, looking at where the Seahawks are, even then at 16, I think it's still a bit too late to draft some of the premier offensive linemen or some of the premier defensive backs that really all these teams need. In all honesty, the Steelers, Seahawks, Packers, Eagles, Commanders, they all need around the same needs on their defensive side of the ball and offensive side of the ball. If they want to really secure themselves a pick, that being all the other teams after the Steelers, I think trading up into the 13s, the 12, anything before 15, I think would be very beneficial. But again, it's going to cost you more. That's why I get into this whole topic of the Steelers, because at 20, you have some areas where you have players or some teams behind the Steelers, like particularly the Bills, the biggest one that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head. a team that's desperate for offensive talent. Yeah, they could get some at 28, which is where they sit right now for Diggs, but their general manager is known for making moves up. Brandon Beane has actually moved up in the first round 4 times in the last 6 years. So that's a team that really entices and really intrigues someone like the Steelers to try and trade back, because at 20, offensive tackle, not really going to be there. At wide receiver, all the best ones are going to go most likely in the top 10. And then at 20, I think it's still pretty early to draft that next group of guys for the value that pick holds. Defensive back as well. If you're not getting Terrion Arnold or Quinyon Mitchell, in my opinion, I think 20, again, is a bit too early for any of those other guys that fall in line right behind those two. I think Mitchell and Arnold are the consensus 1 or 2. Whether you have Arnold 1 or Arnold at 2, that's up to all these teams that make their boards and have the order set heading closer and closer to the draft. So again, at 20, I think it's still too early to move into the next group of guys. And at center, I talked about it a little bit with the Eagles as well, because they moved on from Jason Kelce, and the Steelers moved on from their previous center, Mason Cole, who was released in the offseason. 20, again, if you're looking at Zach Frazier, at potentially Graham Barton from Duke, as well as Jackson Powers Johnson, Field Yates, Mel Kiper have all been on the same page saying that these centers are starting to move back a little bit. Their value hasn't decreased, but I think most teams realize that the field around them isn't in a dire need for centers. So moving them back, having them shift back a little bit in the first round, potentially now into the second round, would make more sense to me, as if I was drafting for the Steelers, to just wait on the centers. Unless you want the absolute best one, at 20 it's still early. I don't even think the Eagles would take Graham Barton at 22 if they could, and if he was still there. So all these things are just screaming for the Steelers to move back. You have the Bills back there. I'm sure the Commanders have been in talks of trading back into the first round, and they have a couple second-round picks that I'm sure the Steelers would be very, very intrigued by. If I remember correctly, I talked about it yesterday, that I think they have 36 and 40. So early second-round picks, starting from 33, obviously. If you have the 36 pick plus the picks that the Steelers have already, that seems enticing. But again, ideally you would want a first-round pick, and I'm just still skeptical of teams like Green Bay, Philly, the Bills, really most of the Bills, just because of Brandon Beane. It's in his nature almost to just trade up and try to find value up, and just moving around the draft, maneuvering himself to find the best value, try to get more picks and stuff like that. But you have to think now that with how the Bills have set up and how this team offensively is lacking a little bit of talent and wide receiver depth, they're going to have to feel moved to make a deal to get up there, to make sure they get their guy. Because the Steelers, in all honesty, could take a wide receiver, it wouldn't surprise me, but they really do most of their work with wide receivers in the second round. So, again, skeptical on that. The Steelers, as well as the Rams, that I'm going to get into later on, are in the weird spots where teams are looking at them. They could trade up, but then again, if the Steelers are too open to trading, those other teams look around and think, why are they so open to trading? They're not going to take the player that I'm thinking of. Let's just keep him there and not really move. But again, you have to see how the field plays out, how all these draft picks line up, because you could have a big run at offensive linemen. There's always a big run in the first round with a certain position. I'm thinking offensive line just because it is the deepest group, and I think teams will start to panic a little bit if they see 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 go before they pick around 18 into the 20s and into a couple picks in the 30s. That'll get some people moving. That'll get some people picking up the phone, calling other teams to try and make a deal up to trade, maybe from the second round even as well. That's always something that I think a lot of people don't talk about, trading into the first round from the second. And ESPN's Field Yates, ESPN's Matt Miller have also touched on this topic. Matt Miller said that Washington potentially trading with Seattle would be enough to trade them their 36th overall pick and their 40th for their 16th for their offensive line, trying to rebuild it as they have. They've added Nick Allegretti. They've added Tyler Biadasz. He's looking at the Commanders to try and trade up. But then again, Seattle might be too expensive at 16, which is why I think the Steelers are in the prime position to be that pick, to be that team to pick up the phone, call the Commanders, and if it doesn't work out with the Seahawks, offer it up and see what you can work out with them. Now with Field Yates, he also reported that he's hearing that the Bills are the most likely trade candidate from what he's heard from all his sources with Brandon Beane and how he usually trades up in the first round anyway. He did it last year with Dalton Kincaid. I'm sure that he wouldn't be shy about doing it again. So those really are the biggest kind of stories following this segment idea with the Steelers trading back. Because in all honesty, I just think the senses around the Steelers right now is that none of their top players on their board will be there at 20. I think right now, if you see someone like Terrion Arnold, Quinyon Mitchell there at 20, potentially just not being taken, not being drafted by any of these other teams, it's all funny how it all falls because if they're there, the Steelers are not going to entertain anything and they're going to draft one of them most likely. There hasn't been a lot of talk around offensive line too much or center. Defensive back is an interesting one, like I mentioned there. Wide receiver as well. Second round is usually where it all happens for the Steelers. And the real just idea to leave this segment off on and just kind of close it out is this idea of Omar Khan now bringing in this more aggressive mindset. A few years ago, you wouldn't really see the Steelers do this other than the time they traded up for Devin Bush. Now I think Omar Khan, their new general manager, has brought in this more aggressive mindset, a lot more open to exploring trades, seeing what other teams are out there have in store for them. And if they like it and if it's good for their football team, they won't have any problem pulling the trigger. It's good for the Steelers in that way to keep their options open. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if they stay there and draft someone that is just not on anybody's board. That's just how the draft works out and how all the surprises it has in store for everyone. We're going to have to wait and see what the Steelers end up doing, but that's another pick to just not sleep on, not lose focus on, because the Steelers are one of those teams that I'm sure the Bills or someone in the later rounds are going to want to call to try and work something out and move up in the first round. Meanwhile, we're going to move on with the show. There's a lot more to talk about on today's episode. I mentioned the Rams picking the first round for the first time in a long time. We're going to talk about CeeDee Lamb and his contract situation with the Cowboys, breaking that all down in finer details. And after the break, I'm going to go into my top 5 players, coaches, or teams under the most pressure to perform in 2024. So stick around, a lot more coming on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, I'll diss my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Jumping back now into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, into the second segment, my top 5 of who is facing the most pressure in 2024 after a crazy free agent period, at least the start of it. It's still going on technically, but we're definitely past the craziest part of it. After all the transactions, stars moving, teams, players getting new coaches in, and getting a real feel of how these teams are starting to filter out and what they're starting to look like, there is a lot of pressure starting to build up with some teams because of their off seasons and everything that I mentioned. I have an honorable mention. I made the list of 5 because just off the top of my head, I thought 5 was a good number. There is a good legitimate reason for 3 potentially, but I think 5 is a good number just to include coaches, players, and teams overall as a whole. And to start off, the honorable mention, because I just had to have them in there. It makes sense after their move. The Houston Texans are the honorable mention for me. They didn't make the top 5 because everyone, as soon as they got Diggs, even before that, getting Danielle Hunter, bringing in Azeez Al-Shaair, you have Tank Dell and what he showed you in his first year, Nico Collins, bringing in Joe Mixon, all of that collective just positive players coming in, positive transactions, fortifying your team, fortifying that defense, plus all the players you already had on defense, Christian Harris, Will Anderson. It all played out great last year, and now you get a guy like Stephon Diggs, and instantly people like myself have them at the top of the AFC, competing, at least on paper, with the Chiefs, with the Bengals, with the Ravens, with the Dolphins. Talent-wise, it's all lining up well for them to stack up against anybody, but you have to go now prove it out on the field, and that's a good amount of pressure for a second-year quarterback. If everyone remembers that CJ only has played in the NFL for 1 year, he still has more learning and growing to do, and that second year is when you always see a dip, unfortunately, for some players that had great years, or them take that huge next step in a very positive, successful career. If they take that step, you got to remember DeMeco Ryans is also a rookie, or was a rookie head coach. Now how he's going to learn and develop is another big thing. So Houston is my honorable mention. I don't think they have as much pressure as the next 5. Starting with number 5, I have Nick Sirianni, the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, hired in 2021, now entering his 4th year of that 5-year contract he signed when he got hired in 2021. Overall, it might seem positive. They have had success. I'm not going to sit here and say that he's on the hot seat, but he is on that border, which is why I have him at number 5, of really just flirting with that area of, you better not let this go too far south like it started to at the end of last season, or else it could start to get very hot in his position as the head coach of the Eagles. He has a 34-17 record as their head coach, but only 2-3 in the postseason. So that's obviously a big thing there, a big topic to kind of monitor with Nick Sirianni. Has done a good job, but again, I want to stress, for the most part of it, along with Howie Roseman and how they've built up this star-studded roster now, or star-studded offense, I should say, more specifically. Now they have one of the best offensive. Their defense is still in the progress of getting rebuilt. They need a few more pieces to get it as strong as they did when they made their Super Bowl run. When the last time they won the Super Bowl, they had a great defense. They're still trying to figure that out right now. Then you add Saquon to this offense that already seemed unstoppable in all sorts of downs. First downs, they had a great running game. You add Saquon to it. Then 3rd and short, you could just run it. QB sneak with Jalen Hurts. You have the weapons on the outside. Goddard, Devontae Smith, Paris Campbell comes over. A.J. Brown. You have all the weapons on offense, as much as anybody would want to have on offense. Now you have Saquon, and people start to look at this offense now. You're going to have to put up points. But on the flip side of it, if their defense isn't living up to the level that they needed to, they're going to be in a lot of shootouts. And unfortunately how shootouts work, how offensive showdowns work. One team is just not going to score. Unfortunately, in the end, something's going to go wrong. There's going to be a false start, a miscommunication somewhere, and it just works out. It's very unlucky, as opposed to if you have a good defense, you can rely on the misfortunes of your offense sometimes, them not scoring, having a bad drive. You can rely on your defense to get you out of that, and it complements each other very well. They have to figure that out still. Coming off last year was very tough and very ugly, and how it all finished out with all the talk about the coordinators switching one from one role to the other, one going up in the box, one coming down to the field. It all got very messy with the Eagles, and I keep mentioning the end of last season. They lost 6 out of their last 7 games, including that loss to the Buccaneers in the playoffs. And again, towards the end, people are looking for an explanation as to why everything just crumbled and it all looks so sloppy. People have started to question his ability to lead, some immaturity at times when you see situations on the sideline. There's been reports of him not having a good relationship with some coaches or getting in arguments with some coaches on the sidelines. Just thinking of the Chiefs game, when they had that big win in Kansas City, you saw him in the tunnel celebrating, as most people should. That's not a bad thing, but he might have overdone it. Just comparing him to other coaches, you wouldn't see Andy Reid, Mike Tomlin, really, John Harbaugh celebrating in that manner. They're celebrate, but his came out a bit more boisterous and a bit more flamboyant, for a lack of a better terms, just screaming and really rubbing it in a little bit to the Chiefs fans. So you wouldn't really see that. There's questions around how he leads and his level of maturity with a position like this. Because they already changed coordinators last season and they brought in more weapons this year, they're not going to move on from Jalen Hurts, who has continued on. They're not going to move on from A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, or any of these players. He is the odd man out in all of this. If things go bad and it doesn't look well at all, people are going to have to look at him now and think of a coaching change, because they've already got rid of the coordinators, like I mentioned, and all the players are under contract, and they're just not going to get rid of them during the season. So he will unfortunately be the odd man out, and because of that, he made the list. But he's only number 5. Not too much pressure, but he is. You got to keep a close eye on him over there in Philadelphia. Number 4, I have the New York Giants as a team. Really, Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll. They were both hired in January of 2022. They surprised a lot of people their first year, winning the playoff game. Daniel Jones looked revived, looked like a whole different quarterback under Brian Daboll. Then the complete opposite last season, bad record, nothing really worse than losing all your players this offseason, and worst of all, extending Daniel Jones, which really puts them in a very bad situation, not only because you're stuck with him, he hasn't really shown you anything, hasn't proven that he could be a top-level quarterback in this league yet. Not only did you extend him, you didn't extend Saquon because you gave Daniel Jones that money. Saquon plays out his final year. Then you lose him for basically nothing to the Philadelphia Eagles. On top of that, you lose your best player on the defensive side of the ball, Xavier McKinney. And now the roster skill level is looking very poor compared to what it was even last year with Saquon, Xavier McKinney, Kayvon Thibodeau. It's a good piece for them. They got Brian Burns back, so that's good. But offensively, you haven't really addressed much, at least to complement or compromise on the losses that you lost with Saquon and all those players. They already didn't have a great wide receiver core, so that was still an issue. Now you add running back to it. And since the Giants have been in this rebuild, struggling process, they have had 5 different head coaches since 2016, 2017. None of them have lasted more than a year or 2 at most. And you want to talk about cutting ties and just not being overly loyal to some of these new hires. Joe Schoen is the first general manager since George Young who has not had previous ties to the New York Giants organization. So you bring in a new guy from the outside, Brian Daboll, just with the trend of the coaches not lasting more than a year or two for 8 years now, going on now 9 years. Both of them, there's no real ties there that keeps them around just based on the trend with the coaches and Joe Schoen coming from the outside. They're not going to have any problem with moving on from those guys, and this is a big year because they sit at number 6. There's been talks about quarterbacks because people just want to move on from Daniel Jones. Wide receiver could be an option there, but is that really going to help too much? I think because they're just in a really bad spot. If it goes bad again and they don't improve too much, these two are unfortunately going to have to go, as well as most likely Daniel Jones, and they're just going to have a massive, I don't even know if you could call it a reset because they've pretty much been in one already this whole time, and they just haven't gotten over the hurdle just yet. And with this still continuing on, I think Joe Schoen, Brian Dable will unfortunately, at least one of them, get the hook and have to let go just because of that. Not seeing any improvement over the last few years. I think they're trending in a direction where it just doesn't leave the Giants really another option to do that. Then, moving into the top 3, number 3, I have Deshaun Watson for the Cleveland Browns. 5 years, $230 million fully guaranteed for Deshaun Watson from that trade with the Houston Texans. If you didn't know, they traded a lot to the Houston Texans for that. And just to recap it all, Cleveland traded 3 first-round picks in 2022, 2023, and 2024, and 2 fourth-round picks and a third-round pick to the Texans for Deshaun Watson. It seems right. Good value coming back for one of the top quarterbacks at the time when they made this trade. Houston, with all of those picks, have flipped their entire franchise to what it is now. If you really think about it, with them drafting Kenyon Green, a starting guard for them now on their offensive line, Dameon Pierce, who's their backup running back, Will Anderson was used with one of those picks, Tank Dell was used with one of those picks, Stephon Diggs now was used with a second-round pick that wasn't even theirs to start with, and as well as C.J. Stroud also coming in and just flipping this whole organization with what they got back from the Cleveland Browns. And what did the Cleveland Browns get? So far, Deshaun Watson has 8 wins, 14 touchdowns, 9 interceptions in only 12 starts in 2 seasons with the Cleveland Browns. 2 seasons and only 8 wins and only 12 starts out of, if I can do the math correctly, 34 or 36 weeks. It's around there. In total for 2 seasons, in total of weeks. So you only have 12 starts out of that. That's only about a third. For the amount of money that you're paying him, he has to be on this list because if it wasn't for this roster already being built up very well, their defense is probably top 2, arguably the best defense in the league. If they didn't have that defense and were struggling with an overpaid quarterback that just hasn't worked out for them so far since that massive trade and extending him to this contract, you can make a solid argument that they could almost be similar to the position that the Denver Broncos are in right now with overpaying Russell Wilson, trading a lot for him, giving him that massive extension. The Browns could be in a similar situation if they didn't have an already filled out roster. Now, that's credit to them. That's obviously a big reason why it hasn't turned south. But Deshaun Watson now is in a position 2 seasons now that you really haven't played or haven't proven anything. And when you have played, he's thrown 14 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. 14 touchdowns isn't a lot in a single season, let alone 2. 9 interceptions is a good amount for a single season, but he only has 12 starts and 9 interceptions. So that ratio, again, doesn't really support paying him all this money and having him miss so much time. He has to be on this list just because he hasn't been reliable enough for the Browns that could go further if they had Deshaun Watson playing and playing to the level that he showed in Houston. Then, to round off the top 2, at number 2, I have the Dallas Cowboys. I've talked a lot about the Cowboys already. last year under contracts with Mike McCarthy, Dak Prescott, and technically now CeeDee Lamb. Pressure to perform as always, but this could be the last year with Dak Prescott, with Mike McCarthy, so there's even more added pressure to them. They're not going to lose CeeDee Lamb or Micah Parsons. I'm sure they're going to get them done, but the quarterback is obviously the biggest position, most value, most importance on a team. Moving on from Dak because he is so dead set on getting this amount of money, it seems, it looks like it's just not going to work out for them. And how is that going to look trying to find a new quarterback, having him successful, trying to get over that hump? With the roster that they have right now, they're in win-now mode. And if you bring in a rookie, trade for another quarterback, you have to go through a transition period. They're really on the border right now of not a full collapse or a rebuild or anything like that because they're too good, but it could look very different from them just making the playoffs to them potentially being a wild card team, maybe missing out on the playoffs the way everybody else is trending up in the NFC East. So that's something to look out for. And number one on my list, I have the New York Jets. They've had the perfect offseason. Everybody now fully believes in the Jets. They got it right this offseason. They realized that they need help around Aaron Rodgers. They've fortified that offensive line. Now, there's no real excuse now, honestly, if you want to talk about all their flaws that they had. They brought in another weapon with Mike Williams. They've built out this roster to the fullest that they could in free agency. Now they have the draft and they have the 10th overall selection to add even more to this. How perfect it has been really leaves you no room to look around for excuses or anybody to help you out because no one's going to feel sorry for Aaron Rodgers, the Jets. If this goes bad, they knew the risk of signing these older, injury-prone-ish players. And if that bites them, it could go bad, and it could go similar to what it did last year. If you have Aaron Rodgers, Morgan Moses, Tyron Smith missing 7, 8, 9 weeks, it could not look any more different than it did last year. And because there's no excuses, no really room to maneuver and look around for anybody to help, and if this doesn't work with these players right now at their age, when is it going to work? When is it going to pay out for the Jets? They don't have a long window to get this right. They're in win-now mode, I think, more than any of these teams, even more so than the Cowboys. Surprisingly, they have to get it right this year because next year, all these players get older, and you don't really know how it's going to look like with Aaron Rodgers now into his 40s, even more. It's a risky area where they're flirting with right now. It has to go right this year. They're my number one team with the most pressure. And I have confidence in them, but, there is pressure there. They have a lot riding on this roster that they've built. Now it's just up to the players and up to Aaron Rodgers to fulfill that with the help that he's gotten. But overall, I want to know what you guys think of my list. Is there anybody I missed out on? Somebody you think shouldn't be on this list? Put it down in the comments or in the chat box during this live episode. In saying that, we're going to move on with the show. I'm going to go to another break. And on the other side, we're going to talk more about CeeDee Lamb and his contract situation, as well as the Rams and what they can look to do with that 19th overall pick. Don't go anywhere. A lot more to come after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back to the show, the second half of today's live episode, talking now about the Los Angeles Rams and their draft scenario. Before I do that, however, one last time in this episode, if you have any questions or comments, use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, with any of your questions or comments. Using this link that you see on your screen or running across the ticker down below makes it able for me to see your questions pop up, read them out loud on air, and make it more engaging, make it more fun for me. In all honesty, it's a big help for the show. Again, if you use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, with any of your questions or comments, we greatly appreciate it every time you guys are able to do that for us. In saying that, back to the Los Angeles Rams and how their draft scenario is looking a lot different for them and specifically for Sean McVay. Sean McVay has been the coach, I don't know if many people know this, for the Rams for the last 7 seasons. And in those 7 seasons, he has never had a first-round pick of his own to start a new year, to start training camp, OTAs. He's never had a guy that he picked in the first round to start a new year, which is crazy. When I read that, I had to bring it up. Because of the success that they've had with Sean McVay and how relevant they've stayed, it's mind-blowing that they haven't even had a chance to draft someone in the first round because of the trends that their general manager, Lee Snead, kind of has built up for himself, this reputation of trading away the picks like they did to get Matthew Stafford, gambling away their future in these picks. It panned out for them. They won the Super Bowl, but I mean, there's no real buts. I just said that they have been successful. I think it's worked out. But now you have another first-round pick finally, and there's a good opportunity for them to get some more quality on this team. I mentioned this is the first time since 2016 that they have a first-round pick, and it's the 19th overall selection, and they're in a similar spot with the Steelers where teams, I'm sure, will call them to inquire about that pick and what their feeling is around moving from there, moving back, and acquiring more talent, which has been the MO of Lee Snead so far. And on his mindset, Lee Snead talked about it back at the owners' meeting a little bit more recently as well, how he values, what his mindset is with some of these trades and trying to maneuver his way around the first round. On that and on their mindset, he said, there are scenarios where, right, if you move back, move up, maybe there's a chance you get 3 players in the first round and in the second round versus only 2. Then there's a possibility you only end up with 1, right, if you move up. He broke it down a little bit there in that interview. And it makes sense from that standpoint. You always wonder why GMs are moving so much in the first round, why someone would move back when there's so much talent left where they are, why people are just left confused as to why they're going to pass up on that potentially. It's all about that value that Lee Snead mentioned, getting 3 players instead of just 1 in the first round, getting 2 players close to each other in the first or second round rather than only getting 1 early in the first round and then another one in the middle of the second round, right? You get them a bit closer together, and there's more value in that. It makes sense. I've wondered about it as well. He broke it down in a very simple, logical way. And since Lee Snead has been on the job, he got the job back in 2012. Funny enough, since then, they've only chosen players in the first round in 5 drafts since 2012. We're going on 12, 13 years since then. To only pick 5 times in the first round really shows how much he is active in the draft on this first day of the NFL draft on April 25th. Starting at 8 o'clock, the first round will begin then. Looking back on those selections that he's made, again, it's pretty much panned out for him in selecting in the first round when he's had the opportunity to. Back in 2012, he selected Michael Brockers, defensive tackle, 14th overall. Then, probably the most popular, second most, Tavon Austin at number 8, and Alec Ogletree at 30 in 2013. Then Greg Robinson, they selected 2nd overall, as well as Aaron Donald, 13th overall in 2014. Then this one surprised me. Todd Gurley, 10th overall in 2015. If you went back to 2015 and saw running backs going top 10 to where it is now, it would completely shock a lot of people. And that pick might look like a complete disaster. Depending on how you look at it, how it all panned out now that Todd Gurley's not in the league, you can see why he was that starting point of people, the devaluing of running backs from him, and how I think he's younger than Derrick Henry. I think I saw somewhere, and he hasn't played in the league for a good amount of years now, and it's crazy how he sort of started that trend, not only with being picked 10th overall, but then wanting that big contract that first round picks usually get as a running back. People started to question the traction on the tires, how much do they have left in them, and he, going back to 2015, sort of started that whole thing along with Le'Veon Bell and others, and how that running back value market just sort of shifted from that point on. Then their most recent selection in 2016 was Jared Goff. They ended up trading him. But for the most part, Ogletree, Tavon Austin, Aaron Donald, Michael Brockers, they've all not been just awful picks, bust by any means. They've gotten good value for those picks. And now, with the retirement of Aaron Donald, you look at this draft, it stresses the need for finding a pass rusher even more because Aaron Donald's not there. They were fortunate to find guys like Kobe Turner, Byron Young from last year's draft class that gave him a good amount of production back. But other than that, now on top of trying to find a spot for Aaron Donald, his replacement, you still have defensive back as a need, linebacker, wide receiver still behind Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. That would be an area to address maybe in the later rounds. Tight end as well. But the good thing about them is that they have 11 picks this year, a lot more than some teams have in the total 7 rounds that there is in the NFL draft. So they could use that to their advantage if they want to move up. It's ironic now, right? Because this year they sit in a spot where the value at 19, they would want to move maybe out of the first round. And it's just ironic because they haven't had a pick in the first round. They've been waiting to have this pick, and now, because of the way it's all panned out, the value there isn't really great. I think the best bang for their buck at that pick could most likely be a defensive tackle. Byron Murphy, the defensive tackle from Texas, is in that range. I've seen him be mocked a lot in the early 20s, mid-20s, early at 16, at 17. So if he falls to 19, you could instantly try and replace Aaron Donald with him in that middle of your defensive line. But with 11 picks, you could try and trade up. That's another option that I'm sure Lee Snead hasn't really completely disregarded. Moving up for a defensive back, I think, again, is a great option if they use 3, maybe 2 picks that they have out of those 11 to move up along with the 19th overall pick with the Broncos, who could use it. Then you have the Raiders, again, who could also use it if they're not going to go quarterback or offensive line. That could be enticing for them, for you to go up and grab one of the top defensive backs, a top pass rusher if they need to, or tight end. If Brock Bowers is still there, try and trade up to number 10 with the New York Jets and assure yourself that you're going to get a X-factor, exciting player like Brock Bowers in your team. Then you don't really need too much wide receiver depth, and you kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone there in getting Brock Bowers because he can move everywhere. Same with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. That would be another intriguing option as well. But right now they sit in a spot where I'm sure Lee Snead is exploring all these options, will take account of all the picks that he has, what he can get later in the rounds with trades with the Bills, the Commanders, like I mentioned. All these teams really past 18, starting with the Rams at 19, could all I wouldn't be surprised. Move back a few spots, move up, get guys from the second round to move up as well. The value right now, because it's so deep at all these classes, people evaluate these prospects differently. Almost everybody has different boards. No one has the exact same board as another team. It all filters in on how they determine who's better than the next, if they really want them, if they feel another team's going to get them, trying to trade up and all that stuff like that. The Rams are, again, in a good spot where, yeah, they haven't had a first-round pick in a while, but where they sit right now to wrap this all up, trying to find their best bang for their buck, to try and really get the best out of Matthew Stafford. He is on the older side, and you're still getting good production out of him, but he certainly doesn't have another 4 years, 3 years left in him. I would say probably max 2, if not next year being his last year. You have to maximize that as much as you can to fill out this roster with the best talent, to make sure you can go further. They have great stepping stones to do that. Kyron Williams, Puka, Cooper Kupp, Kobe Young, or Kobe Turner, and Byron Young. All solid pieces to build on. Now you just have to refine it a little bit with this year's draft and get better, because Matthew Stafford, once he moves on, then you have an even bigger problem, potentially, than Aaron Donald moving on. So that's where the Rams sit right now, trying to figure all that out to compete in the NFC that, again, is wide open. I think most of those teams can compete, and you can't predict right now who's going to finish where in the NFC, which makes it more exciting and more conversational to keep talking about this throughout the offseason and into the regular season as well. But in the meantime, we're going to leave it there. We're going to go into the final break, a short one, and after that, we're going to come back and talk about the Cowboys more, and specifically their star wide receiver, CeeDee Lamb, heading into the final year of his contract, and how the Cowboys can maneuver around that so it doesn't become an even bigger problem for them. More on that story coming up in just a few seconds. Stick around to watch on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Thank you for joining me on this last segment of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to revisit one of our ongoing favorite topics on this show, the Dallas Cowboys. I've talked a lot about Dak Prescott, their owner, Jerry Jones, Vice President Stephen Jones. Now it's CeeDee Lamb's turn. You could argue their best player last year along with Micah Parsons, but CeeDee had a historical year for the Dallas Cowboys, broke a good amount of records, Cowboys records in that season, made first-team All-Pro, was in the Pro Bowl. One of the best years for him, and it's great that the Cowboys have that sort of receiver on their team. The bad part is now, on how you interpret it, is because it all filters into this situation now with contracts for their three biggest players, Dak Prescott, CeeDee, and Micah. Having Micah play on such a high level on his rookie deal still, and not having extended him when you could have last year is great, but again, it bites you because now when you could have gone for cheaper last year when he was eligible, now you're certainly going to have to pay something close to a Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, who are also getting close to that negotiation period. More so for Jamar Chase. Justin Jefferson is already in that period trying to negotiate that with the Vikings. So now it's going to cost more for the Dallas Cowboys. This is the fifth year, final year for CeeDee Lamb on his rookie deal, like I mentioned. The Cowboys picked up his fifth-year option last year. Now, Dallas is scheduled to start their Phase 1 workouts next week on April 15th. Those are still voluntary workouts. Coaches, everyone on the staff expects most players to show up. But with this now carrying over into the offseason workouts now, some people are starting to begin to speculate that it could be heading into holdout sort of territory with CeeDee Lamb. According to the Dallas Morning News, yesterday, CeeDee Lamb is not expected to attend the voluntary workouts starting next Monday. He could even hold out into training camp, is what was reported by the Dallas Morning News. Lamb, like I mentioned, became extension eligible last year. But the reports around that whole situation dating back to that year was that the Cowboys didn't really push very hard back then either to extend CeeDee Lamb. It's starting to become a trend now with the Cowboys, and it's not a great trend to add to the reputation that you have. More often than not, the Cowboys usually pay their stars. Jerry Jones pays his guys that he really values, really things can contribute to what he's building, what he has built with the Cowboys, I should say. But along with eventually paying and eventually, really in all honesty, paying a lot more than he should have, that is one of the trends that is starting to develop with the Cowboys that I am not really a big fan of it. Waiting too long is one of them with Jerry Jones and these players, waiting too long to extend their big stars, Jerry's guys. And by doing that, you ultimately end up paying more. With Dak Prescott now waiting a bit too much, having the season that he did last year, you're going to have to pay him more. He's going to want more, like all the reports have said, up to $50-60 million I think he wanted per year. He hasn't come out and said that it is true, but it wouldn't surprise a lot of people that he wants that because he had one of his best years. CeeDee now most likely, again, had a decent year 2 years ago, didn't get an extension. You let him play this final year or second to last year, this past season, and he goes crazy. First team All-Pro. Now he needs money like a top 5 receiver up in that $30 million per year range that Tyreek Hill had. He's not going to be the top earner, most likely. That's probably going to go to Justin Jefferson. But you're going to have CeeDee Lamb looking at Jefferson and how his production has gone. Similar numbers just off of this past year. Why would he not think he needs as much money as Justin Jefferson when he almost has better, if not the same sort of stats as Justin Jefferson, and how valuable he is to the Cowboys? It wouldn't be out of the realm for CeeDee to think that he needs to be paid like a top guy. Then, if you look at other situations, contract situations that have worked out with the Cowboys, another trend is that they pay players coming off of injuries, really, and they overpay with some of these guys. Michael Gallup, Terrence Steele. It wasn't so bad. Terrence Steele, they paid him after an ACL injury, and he has been reliable for the most part, but they did pay him a lot of money. Michael Gallup, they paid him a good amount of money, and now he's not even on the team. They had to release him to alleviate some of that salary cap stronghold that they got themselves into with these high price deals. So they have to let him go, and now he's a free agent that you paid all this money to. And they've also been known to sign players at low value for positions that are of low value, paying players too early at low value, not high compensation sort of positions. Like Ezekiel Elliott, they gave him a big contract, and he's also now a free agent again, trying to find his way on a new team this year. And you think back to the time when he was with the Cowboys and they gave him that deal. Was it smart to pay him so early at a running back position? I've said on this show that I'm not a fan of the way it's trending, but the way that the Cowboys knew that this whole running back market was sort of panning out and they still gave him that much money. I don't know how much per year, but still with that deal with Zeke, it hasn't worked out now. In hindsight, you look back to Jalen Smith is another one. He came in off of a bad knee injury, had some production in some years with the Dallas Cowboys, but when he signed a deal, he is now currently, you look at his situation now, he is a free agent, hasn't been a significant part of a team in some time now. So all of that wraps up in a cycle that the Cowboys just constantly seem to find themselves in. Zach Martin, I want to say, is another player that is also in the last year of his deal, this year or next year. So another significant part of your team that you have to figure out. Are you ready to move on from Zach Martin as well? All of these things tie in together when you're talking about the Cowboys and these players, because instead, now, if there is a holdout with CeeDee Lamb, if he does decide to go this route, which it has come out recently through an interview with TMZ or just speaking to TMZ, whenever, yesterday or today, CeeDee Lamb has said that he will be with the Dallas Cowboys this year, but he didn't really specify in what aspect. I think they asked him when the season starts, and he said, yeah, he'll be in Dallas, but he didn't mention anything about training camp, OTAs, mandatory minicamp. He didn't mention anything like that. To avoid fines, he can be there, but he doesn't have to participate in any of the drills or practices where he could get injured, and there's that risk, so he holds that leverage over the Dallas Cowboys. It's a strategic move that has most likely worked out for the players that have decided to go this route. You look at Chris Jones, his was a bit more of a serious holdout, holding out into the season until the Chiefs eventually gave him that one-year deal for a good amount of money. Then they've extended him this offseason. That worked out for Chris Jones. I'm not saying CeeDee Lamb is heading that way, or I'm projecting him to be that extreme about it, but it is just a strategic and a smart move for CeeDee Lamb to get the ball rolling a little bit, because the biggest thing with the Cowboys and these contracts that just start piling up, they're almost like a shield or a cover-up for the real problems that they still haven't addressed. By stacking all these problems and trying to figure out their biggest stars, because that's also very significant, by doing that, they just add to the list of problems. Once they figure out Micah Parsons, once they figure out CeeDee Lamb, and maybe Dak Prescott, you still have this long list of defensive line help that you need, defensive back help that you need. Stephon Gilmore, probably your best cornerback last year, is still a free agent. You still have him to figure out. Leighton Vander Esch just retired, so you need linebackers. You need spots on that offensive line. Another wide receiver to add on to CeeDee Lamb to complement that offense, as well as running back. When are the Cowboys going to get to all of these positions that they need to fill out if they're stacking up CeeDee Lamb's contract, Micah Parsons' contract, Dak's contract? Trying to figure out and negotiate with that takes up a lot of time, which frankly they don't have if they want to build out this roster to the best of the ability that they can. I know it's only April 9th now, a long time from playing football, from being week one, but again, the way that the Cowboys have built this reputation of taking their time, a methodical, long time to figure out all these things, you can't help but think it's just going to carry on into August, September, and when are they going to find the time? They've not done anything in free agency. When are they going to find the time to add to this roster that desperately needs help in a very competitive NFC that's only getting better and trending up, with all these teams getting better, like the Falcons? The Bucks are no joke. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. The Bears are getting better with some of the trades that they've made. The Lions are there, the Niners, the Eagles, all seemingly getting better, where the Cowboys are still stuck in first gear, not really doing anything as of now. They're always going to use the excuse of salary cap and not having enough cap to work around it and get all these players. But if they would have figured out some of these extensions earlier to benefit them, they'd have a bit more wiggle room with their salary cap to figure out some of these issues. Now it's starting to back up on them, and they're not going to, in my estimation, they're not going to have enough time to figure out every single one of these needs and fill out a competitive roster. But we've seen this already for a few years from the Cowboys. It's not really anything new. And it could be coming to a point where you're going to have a roster turnover of sorts, and it could be looking different in the near future for the Cowboys if they don't pick up the pace a little bit with this team. the Cowboys are the Cowboys. You know, I say all these things, but it just turns out the same way as it always does every year. I'm hoping for a change this year, but we shall see where Jerry Jones take this season. But in saying that, I have run out of time on today's episode. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as both Sports Network and Podcast Networks on YouTube. Make sure to also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok for more of this network's content. If you want to see more of me and the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, check out the YouTube channels, the GSMC Sports Network channel, and the Podcast Network channel for YouTube shorts that are posted on there daily. You have the full recorded live shows that are all on there as well, on top of all the individual segments that are cut up into individual videos if you want to go back and watch a specific segment, or if you missed out on a segment that you really wanted to watch. They're all on there on both channels. As always, tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more NFL and football conversations with me, your host, Manny Maradiege. Thank you guys again for joining me, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.